Happy Monday, guys. I'm going to be reading chapters 15, 16, and 17 to you today. I hope you had a good weekend, and I hope you enjoyed. Don't forget to go to the Google Doc to participate. Chapter 15. What on earth did you think you were doing? Eric was so angry that, for a moment, George wished he were still on the roller coaster Comet heading straight for the heart of the sun. Actually, we weren't on the Earth, murmured Annie, who was struggling out of her suit. I heard that. George hadn't thought Eric could get any angrier than he already was, but now he looked so furious, George thought he might explode. He half expected to see great jets of steam burst out of his ears, just like the ones on the comet. Go to your room, Annie, ordered Eric. I'll talk to you later. But, Daddy, Annie began, but even she fell silent under Eric's glare. She pulled off her heavy space boots, wriggled out of her suit, and shot out of the door like a streak of blonde lightning. By George, she muttered as she ran past him. As for you, Eric said, in such a menacing tone that George's blood ran cold. But then he realized Eric wasn't talking to him. He was looming over Cosmos, casting threatening looks at the computer screen. Master, said Cosmos mechanically, I am just a humble machine. I can only obey the commands I am given. Ridiculous, cried Eric wildly. You are the world's most powerful computer. You let 2 children travel into outer space by themselves. If I hadn't come home when I did, who knows what might have happened? You should have stopped them. Oh, dear Eric, I think I'm about to crash, replied Cosmos, and his screen suddenly went blank. Eric clutched his head in his hands and staggered around the room for a minute. I can't believe this, he said as though to himself. Terrible, terrible, he groaned loudly. What a disaster. I'm very sorry, said George timidly. Eric whipped around and stared at him. I trusted you, George, he said. I would have never showed you Cosmos if I thought that a minute my back was turned, you would sneak through the doorway into outer space like that. And taking a younger child with you? You have no idea how dangerous it is out there. George wanted to shout that it was so unfair. It wasn't his fault. It was Annie who had pushed them both through the doorway into outer space, not him, but he kept quiet. Annie, he figured, was in enough trouble already without him making it worse. There are things in outer space you can't even imagine, continued Eric. Extraordinary, fascinating, enormous, amazing things. But dangerous, so dangerous. I was going to tell you about them, but now, he shook his head, I'm going to take you home. And then Eric said a terrible thing. I need to have a word with your parents. As George found out afterward, Eric had more than just one word with his parents. In fact, he had quite a few, enough to make them feel very disappointed in their son. They were very hurt that despite all their good intentions about bringing up George to love nature and hate technology, he'd been caught red-handed at Eric's house playing with a computer, a valuable and delicate one no less, one that wasn't for kids to touch. Worse, George had invented some kind of game, Eric had become somewhat vague at this point, which he'd persuaded Annie to join in. And this game had been very dangerous and very silly. As a result, the 2 children were both grounded and not allowed to play together for a whole month. Good, said George when his dad told him what his punishment would be. At that moment, he never wanted to see Annie again. She got him into so much trouble already, and yet George had been the one to take all the blame. And, added George's dad, who was looking very angry and bristly today with his big, bushy beard and his itchy, hairy, homemade shirt, Eric promised me he will keep his computer locked up so neither of you will be able to get near it. No, yelled George, he can't do that. Oh, yes, he can, said George's dad very severely, and he will. But Cosmos will get lonely all by himself, said George, too upset to realize what he was saying. George, his dad said, looking worried, do you understand that this is a computer and not a living being we're talking about? Computers can't get lonely. They don't have feelings. But this one does, shouted George. Oh, dear, sighed his dad. If this is the effect that technology has on you, you see how right we are to keep you away from it. George ground his teeth in frustration at the way adults twisted everything to make it sound like they were always right, and then dragged his feet up the stairs to his room. The world suddenly seemed a much more boring place. George knew he was going to miss Cosmos, but what he didn't expect was that he would miss Annie too. At first he was pleased to be banned from seeing her. It was good to have a punishment that stopped him from doing something he didn't want to do anyway. But after a while he found himself looking for the flash of her golden hair. He told himself he was just bored. He was grounded, so he couldn't go and see any of his other friends, and there wasn't much for him to do at home that was any fun. His mom wanted him to weave a rug for his bedroom, and his dad attempted him to get interested in homemade electricity generator. George tried to be enthusiastic, but felt rather flat. The only bright star in his life was that he'd seen a poster at school advertising a science presentation competition. The first prize was a computer. George desperately wanted to win. He spent ages trying to write a really good talk about the wonders of the universe and drawing pictures of the planet he'd seen on the comet ride, but no matter how hard he tried, he just couldn't seem to get the words right. Everything sounded wrong. Eventually he gave up in frustration and resigned himself to a boring life forever and ever. But then, at last, something interesting happened. One gray autumn afternoon at the end of October, the slowest and dullest month he'd ever lived through, George was loafing around in the backyard when he noticed something unusual. Through a small round hole in the fence, he saw something very blue. He went over to it and pressed his eye socket to the fence. From the other side, he heard a squeak. "George," said a familiar voice. He was eye to eye with Annie. "We're not supposed to be talking to each other," he whispered through the fence. "I know," she said, "but I'm so bored." "You're bored, but you've got Cosmos." "No, I haven't," said Annie. "My dad has locked him up so I can't play with him anymore," she sniffed. "I'm not even allowed to go trick-or-treating for Halloween this evening." "Me neither," said George. "I've got a pretty witch's costume too," said Annie sadly. "My mom's making pumpkin pie right now," George told her grumly. "I bet it'll be horrible, and when she's finished, I'll have to go and eat a slice of it in the kitchen." "Pumpkin pie?" said Annie longingly. "That sounds really good. Can I have your slice if you don't want it?" "Yeah, but you're not allowed in my kitchen, are you? After what happened the last time we played together." "I'm really sorry," said Annie, "about the comet ride and the asteroids and the jets of gas and my dad getting angry with you and everything. I didn't mean it." George didn't reply. He thought of so many angry things to say to Annie, but now that he was nearly face to face with her, he didn't feel like saying any of them. "Oh, dear," Annie sniffed. From the other side of the fence, George thought he heard the noise of crying. "Annie?" he called quietly. "Annie?" George heard a sound like someone furiously blowing their nose. He ran down the length of the fence, and his dad had started to mend the hole where Freddie had broken through into next door, but he'd gotten distracted halfway through and had forgotten to finish the job. There was still a gap, maybe large enough for a small person to squeeze through. "Annie," George poked his head through the space. He could see her on the other side now, wiping her nose on her sleeve and rubbing her eyes. Wearing normal clothes, she no longer looked like a strange fairy child or a visitor from outer space. She just looked like a lonely little girl. Suddenly, George felt really sorry for her. "Come on," he said. "Climb through. We can hide together in Freddie's sty." "But I thought you hated me," said Annie, scampering down to the hole in the fence. "Because of—" "Oh, that," said George carelessly, as though he'd never given it a moment's thought. "When I was a little kid, I would have minded," he said grandly, "but I don't now." "Oh," said Annie, whose face was blurred by tears. "So we can be friends?" "Only if you climb through the fence," teased George. "But what about your dad?" asked Annie doubtfully. Won't he be angry?" "He's gone out," said George. "He won't be back for hours." In fact, that morning George had been pretty glad to be grounded. Sometimes on Saturdays his dad took George with him when he went on a global warming protest marches. When he was younger, George had loved the marches. He'd thought that walking through the centers of town carrying a sign and shouting slogans was great. The eco-warriors were fun, and sometimes they would give George piggyback rides or mugs of steaming homemade soup. But now that George was older, he found going on marches was a bit embarrassing. So when his dad had sternly told him that morning that, as a part of his ongoing punishment, he would have to miss that day's protest march and stay at home, George pretended to be sad so as not to hurt his dad's feelings, but secretly he had breathed a sigh of relief. "Come on, Annie, jump through," he said. The pigsty wasn't the warmest or the most comfortable place to sit, but it was the one best hidden from angry grown-up eyes. George thought Annie might protest at the smell of pig, which wasn't as strong as people tended to think, but she just wrinkled her nose and then snuggled down in some straw in the corner. Freddie was asleep, his warm breath coming out in little piggy snores as he dozed, his big head resting on his hooves. "So, no more adventures?" George asked Annie, settling down next to her. "Not likely," said Annie, scuffing her sneakers against the pigsty wall. "Dad says I can't go into outer space again until I'm really old, like 23 or something." 23? But that's ancient. "I know," sighed Annie. "It's forever away. But at least he didn't tell my mom. She would have been really angry. I promised her I'd look after Dad and stop him from doing anything silly." "Where is your mom anyway?" asked George. "My mom," said Annie, tilting her head in a way he hadn't come to recognize, "is dancing Swan Lake with the Beloshi Ballet in Moscow." In his sleep, Freddie gave a loud snort. "No, she isn't," said George. "Even Freddie knows that's not true." "Huh, all right," agreed Annie. "She's taking care of Granny, who isn't very well." "Then why didn't you say so?" "Because it's much more interesting to say something else." "But it was true about outer space, wasn't it?" "Yes, it was," said George, "and it was amazing, but—" He paused. "What?" said Annie, who was braiding Freddie's straw. Why does your dad go there? I mean, why does he have Cosmos? What's he for?" "Because he's trying to find a new planet in the universe." "What sort of new planet?" asked George. "A special one where people could live, in case the Earth gets too hot." "Wow, has he found one?" "Not yet," said Annie, "but he keeps looking and looking, everywhere across all the galaxies in the universe. He can't stop until he finds one." "That's amazing. I wish I had a computer that could take me across the whole universe. Actually, I wish I had a computer at all." "You don't have a computer?" Annie sounded surprised. "Why not?" "I'm saving up for one, but it's going to take years and years and years." "That's not much good, is it?" "So," said George, "I'm entering a science competition and the first prize is a computer, a really huge one." "What competition?" "It's a science presentation. You have to give a talk, and the person who gives the best one wins the computer. Lots of schools are taking part." "Oh, I know," said Annie, sounding excited. "I'm going to it with my school. It's next week, isn't it? I'm staying at Granny's all next week, but I'll see you at the competition." "Are you entering?" George asked, suddenly worried that Annie, with her interesting life, scientific know-how, and vivid imagination, would pull off a presentation that made his own sound about as exciting as cold rice pudding. "No, of course not," said Annie. "I don't want to win a stupid computer. If it was some ballet shoes, then that would be different." "What are you going to talk about?" "Well," said George shyly, "I've been trying to write something about the solar system, but I don't think it's very good. I don't know very much about it." "Yes, you do," said Annie. "You know lots more than almost anyone else at school does. You've actually seen parts of the solar system, like Saturn, Jupiter, asteroids, and even Earth from outer space." "But what if I give it all wrong?" "Why don't you get Dad to check it for you?" suggested Annie. "He's so mad at me," said George sadly. "He won't want to help me." "I'll ask him this evening," said Annie firmly, "and then you can come by after school on Monday and talk to him." At that moment, there was a gentle tap at the roof. The two children both froze as the door to the pigsty swung open. "Hello," said a nice voice. "It's my mom," George mouthed silently to Annie. "Oh no," she mouthed back. "Trick or treat," said George's mom. "Treat?" said George hopefully. Annie nodded. "Treat for two?" "Yes, please," replied George. "For me and, Freddie, that is." "Freddie's a funny name for a girl," said George's mom. "Oh, please, George's mom," Annie burst out. She couldn't stay silent any longer. "Don't let George get into more trouble. It isn't his fault." "Don't worry," said George's mom in the kind of voice that they both knew meant she was smiling. "I think it's silly that you can't play together. I brought you both a snack, some nice broccoli muffins and a slice of pumpkin pie." With a squeak of delight, Annie fell on the plate full of lumpy, funny-shaped muffins. "Thank you," she mumbled through her mouthful of muffin. "These are delicious." Chapter 16. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, George's dad was enjoying his environmental protest march. Holding up huge signs and shouting slogans, the campaigners charged across the shopping district, batting the crowds aside. "The planet is dying," they yelled as they marched to the town square. "Recycle plastic bags! Ban the car!" they bellowed to surprise passerbys. "Stop wasting the Earth's resources," they yelled. When they reached the middle of the square, George's dad jumped up onto the base of the statue to give a speech. "Now is the time to start worrying, not tomorrow," he began. No one heard him, so one of his friends handed him a megaphone. "Why, we don't have that many years left to save the planet," he repeated, this time so loudly that everyone in the area could hear him. "If the Earth's temperature continues to rise," he went on, "by the end of the century, floods and droughts will kill thousands and force over 200 million people to flee from their homes. Much of the world will become uninhabitable, food production will collapse, and people will starve. Technology will not be able to save us because it will be too late." A few people in the crowd were clapping and nodding their heads. George's dad felt quite surprised. He'd been coming to these marches for years and years, handing out flyers and giving speeches. He'd got quite used to the people ignoring him or telling him he was crazy because he believed that people owned too many cars, caused too much pollution, and relied too heavily on energy-consuming machines. And now, suddenly, people were listening to the environmental horror story he'd been talking about for so long. "The polar ice caps are melting, the seas are rising, the climate is getting warmer and warmer," he went on. "The advances in science and technology have given us the power to destroy our planet. Now we need to work out how to save it." By now, a little group of Saturday shoppers had stopped to hear what he had to say. A small cheer went up from the people listening. "It's time to save our planet," yelled George's dad. "Save our planet," the campaigners shouted back at him. One or two of the shoppers joined in. "Save our planet! Save our planet!" As a few more people cheered, George's dad lifted his arms in the air in a victory salute. He felt very excited. At last, people were taking some notice of the terrible state the planet was in. He suddenly realized that all those years he had spent trying to raise public awareness were not lost after all. It all started to work. All the eco-friendly groups had not protested in vain. When the cheers trailed off, George's dad was about to speak again when suddenly, out of nowhere, a huge custard pie sailed across the heads of the crowd and hit him right in the face. There was a moment of shocked silence, and then everyone burst out laughing at the sight of poor George's dad standing there with runny cream dripping down his beard. Wriggling through the onlookers, a group of boys dressed in Halloween costumes started running away from the square. "Catch them!" shouted someone in the crowd, pointing to the band of masked figures sprinting away as fast as they could, laughing their heads off as they went. George's dad didn't really mind. After all, people had been throwing things at him for years while he made his speeches. He'd been arrested, jostled, insulted, and thrown out of so many places in his efforts to make people understand the dangers the planet faced that one more custard pie didn't upset him very much. He just wiped the sticky goo out of his eyes and got ready to continue talking. A few of the other green campaigners ran after the group of demons, devils, and zombies, but they were soon left behind, staggering and gasping for breath. When the boys realized that the grown-ups had given up the chase, they came to a halt. "Ha ha ha ha," snickered one of them, ripping off his zombie mask to reveal the features of Ringo. His real face wasn't much more attractive than the rubber mask. "That was great," gasped Whippet, stripping off his black and white scream mask. "The way you threw that pie, Ringo?" "Yeah," agreed an enormous devil, swishing his tail and waving his pitchfork. "You got him right on the nose. Judging by his great size, it could be none other than Tank, the boy who just couldn't stop growing." "I love Halloween," said Ringo happily. "No one will ever know it was us." "What should we do next?" squeaked Zit, who was dressed as Dracula. "Well, we've run out of pies," said Ringo, "so we're going to play some tricks now. Some good ones. I've got some ideas." By late afternoon, the boys had given quite a few people living on their small town a bad fright. They'd shot an old lady with a colored water from a toy pistol. They'd thrown purple flour over a group of small kids, and they'd set off firecrackers under a parked car, making its owner think they'd blown it up. Each time they had caused as much havoc as possible and then scampered away very quickly before anyone could catch them. Now they had reached the edge of town, where the houses started to spread out. Instead of narrow streets with rows of snug little cottages, the buildings got bigger and farther apart. These houses had long green lawns in front of them, with big hedges and crunchy gravel driveways. It was getting dark, and some of these enormous houses, with their blank windows, columns, and fancy front doors, were starting to look quite eerie in the dim light. Most of them were dark and silent, so the gang didn't even bother ringing their doorbell. They were just about to give up for the day when they came to the very last house in the town, a huge rambling place with turrets, crumbling statues, and old iron gates hanging off their hinges. On the ground floor, lights were blazing from every window. "Last one," announced Ringo cheerfully, "so let's make it a good one. Tricks ready?" His band of boys checked their stash of trick weapons and hurried along behind him up the weed-covered driveway. But as they approached the house, they all noticed a strange eggy smell which grew stronger as they approached the front door. "Hoo-wee," said the huge devil, holding his nose. "Who did that?" "Wasn't me," squawked Zit. "He who smelt it dealt it," said Ringo ominously. The smell was getting so overpowering now the boys were finding it hard to breathe. As they edged toward the front door where the paint was peeling off, the woodwork in ribbons, the air itself became thick and gray. Hand over his mouth and Ringo reached forward and pressed the giant round doorbell. It made a sad, lonely clanging noise, as though it wasn't used very often. To the boys' surprise, the door opened a crack and a finger of yellowish-gray smoke curled through the narrow gap. "Yes?" said an unpleasant voice that was somehow familiar. "Trick or treat?" croaked Ringo, almost unable to speak. "Trick!" cried the voice, throwing the door wide open. For a fleeting second, the boy saw a man wearing an old-fashioned gas mask standing in the doorway. Another second, and a great cloud of stinky yellow and gray smoke rolled out through the open door, and a man vanished from view. "Run!" Ringo yelled. His gang didn't need telling twice. They had already turned tail and were rushing back through the thick smog. Panting and wheezing, they staggered down the drive, through the gates, and onto the pavement. They ripped off their Halloween masks so they could breathe better after choking on the smelly smoke. But Ringo wasn't with them. He had tripped in the driveway and fallen onto the gravel. He was struggling to his feet when he saw the man from the big house walking toward him. "Help! Help!" he yelled. The other members of the gang stopped and turned, but no one wanted to go back for him. "Quick!" said Zit, who was the smallest. "Go and save Ringo!" The other two just shuffled awkwardly and mumbled. The spooky man wasn't wearing a gas mask anymore, and the boys could almost make out his features through the clearing smoke. Ringo was standing up now, and the man seemed to be speaking to him, although the other boys couldn't hear what he said. After a few minutes, Ringo turned and waved to his gang. "Hey," he shouted, "all of you, get over here!" Reluctantly, the other three straggled toward him. Strangely, Ringo seemed very pleased with himself. Standing next to him, looking just a tiny bit sinister, was none other than Dr. Reaper. Chapter 17. "Good afternoon, boys," said the teacher. He looked at them standing there in their Halloween costumes, clutching their masks. "How kind of you to think of including your poor old teacher in your fun Halloween games." "But we didn't know," protested Zit. The other two looked too surprised to speak. We wouldn't have, not if we'd known it was a teacher's house." "Don't you worry," said Dr. Reaper with a forced chuckle. "I like to see young people enjoying themselves." He waved a hand around to clear a bit of the lingering smelly smoke. "I'm afraid you interrupted me as I was in the middle of something. That's why it's a little foggy around here." "Oh, were you cooking?" said Whippet. Unhappily, "It stinks here." "No, not cooking. Well, not food anyway," said Dr. Reaper. "I was doing an experiment. I should get back to it, and I shouldn't keep you here. I'm sure you have other people in the neighborhood to delight with your amusing tricks." "What about," said Ringo, trailing off deliberately. "Oh, yes," said Dr. Reaper. "Why don't you boys come and wait in the doorstep while I go and get something? I'll only be a moment." The boys followed him as far as the open front door, where they hovered while Dr. Reaper went in. "What's going on?" Whippet hissed to Ringo as they waited. "Listen up, gang," said Ringo importantly. "Gather around. Reaper wants us to do something for him, and he's gonna pay us." "Yeah, but what does he want us to do?" asked Tank. "Relax, chill," replied Ringo. "It's nothing. He just wants us to deliver a letter to the house with the weirdo in the spacesuit." "And he'll pay us for that?" squeaked Zit. "Why?" "Don't know," admitted Ringo, "and I don't really care. It's money, isn't it? That's what matters." They waited for a little longer. The minutes ticked by, and there was still no sign of Reaper. Ringo peeked through the front door. "Let's go in," he said. "We can't do that," exclaimed the others. "Yeah, we can," said Ringo, his eyes sparkling with mischief. "Just think, at school we can tell everyone we've been inside Grieper's house. Let's see if we can take something of his. Come on." He tiptoed in the house, stopped, and beckoned furiously for the others to follow. One by one they sidled through the front door. Inside they saw a hallway with several doors leading off it. Everything in the hallway was covered with dust, as though no one had touched it for 100 years. "This way," ordered Ringo, snickering with glee. He set off down the hallway, stopping in front of one of the doors. "I wonder what the old doc keeps in here." He pushed it open. Well, what's this?" he said, a sly smile spreading across his face as he peered in. "Seems like there's more to the doc than meets the eye." The other boys crowded around him to see what lay in the room beyond their eyes, widening as they took in the strange scene before them. "Wow," said Zit. "What's in there?" But before anyone could answer, Dr. Reaper had reappeared in the hallway behind them. "I asked you," he said with the scariest voice imaginable, "to wait outside." Sorry, sir, said the boys quickly, whipping around to face him. "Did I invite you in my house? I don't think so. Perhaps you could explain why you have behaved so very badly, or I will be forced to give you extra detention at school for disobedience." "Yes, sir, said Ringo very fast. "We were waiting outside, but we were so interested to know the experiment you talked about earlier. We wanted to come in and see." "You were?" said Dr. Reaper suspiciously. "Oh, yes," chorused the boys enthusiastically. "I wasn't aware that any of you were interested in science," said Dr. Reaper, sounding a little happier. "Oh, sir, we love science," Ringo assured him fervently. "Tank here wants to be a scientist when he grows up." Tank looked rather startled, but then tried to compose his face into what he hoped was an intelligent expression. "Really?" said Dr. Reaper, peering up considerably. "This is wonderful news. You must all come into my laboratory. I've been longing to show someone what I've been working on, and you seem like the perfect boys. Come in, please. I can tell you all about it." "What have you gotten us into now?" muttered Whippet to Ringo as they followed Dr. Reaper into the room. "Shut up," Ringo replied out of the corner of his mouth. "It was this or detention. Look sharp, all right? I'll get us out as soon as I can."